Welcome to Crime Documentary, where shadows from the past still whisper in the alleys of history. Some crimes are so brutal, so mysterious, that they scar not only a city, but the entire world. Tonight, we step into the chilling heart of Los Angeles. In 1947, where dreams and nightmares danced side by side, a young aspiring actress vanished into the darkness, only to return in death with a horror so shocking it earned her the name the Black Dahlia. What happened to Elizabeth Short still remains one of the darkest unsolved mysteries in American crime history. Los Angeles in the winter of 1947 was a city of contradictions, a place where glamour and darkness existed side by side. The streets were alive with neon lights, nightclubs, and jazz echoing through smoky rooms, while at the same time alleyways hid secrets that never made it to the newspapers. Hollywood was selling a dream to the world, a dream of beauty, wealth, and fame. But for thousands of young women arriving daily, it was a cruel promise rarely kept. On the morning of January 15th, the city awoke to a story that would shatter the illusion of safety forever and reveal a crime so disturbing it would be remembered for decades. That morning, the neighborhood of Flemert Park was quiet, the kind of Los Angeles street where children could still play without fear, where neighbors exchanged greetings and the sound of radios drifted from open windows. A woman named Betty Bersinger was pushing her young daughter's stroller down South Norton Avenue. She was heading toward a shoe repair shop, her mind occupied with everyday thoughts, when her eyes caught something in the vacant lot to her left. At first, she slowed only out of mild curiosity. The shape was pale and motionless, lying in the grass close to the sidewalk. From a distance, it looked like a discarded mannequin, the kind used in store windows. People often dumped broken objects in empty lots, and so, in those first seconds, it didn't feel like anything worth paying attention to. But then she noticed the strange way the figure was arranged, as if deliberately placed there. Something about it didn't look right. She pushed the stroller closer, and as the winter sunlight fell across the figure, realization struck her like a lightning bolt. This was no mannequin. It was a human body, sliced clean in half at the waist. The two pieces carefully positioned a short distance apart. Bersinger froze, her heart pounding, unable to process what she was seeing. Her daughter fussed in the stroller, tugging her back to reality. With terror flooding her chest, she turned and ran toward the nearest house, pounding on the door and shouting for someone to call the police. When officers arrived minutes later, the scene they encountered left them shaken. Even in a city accustomed to crime, this was unlike anything they had ever seen. The body was of a young woman, completely drained of blood, her skin so pale it appeared marble white. She had been washed clean before being placed there, scrubbed of dirt and blood, almost like a grotesque display. The cuts that separated her torso from her legs were precise, surgical in their accuracy, as though the killer had knowledge of anatomy. Her arms were stretched above her head, bent at sharp angles, while her lower half had been set a few feet away, as though arranged with careful thought. Most horrifying of all was her face. A deep slash carved from each corner of her mouth up toward her ears, creating a twisted, eternal grin that mocked the innocence of her youth. Detectives on the scene could hardly bring themselves to look directly at her without turning away in shock. The news spread quickly. Within hours, journalists crowded the site, scribbling notes, snapping photographs, already preparing sensational headlines. Neighbors gathered at a distance, whispering about what kind of monster could have committed such a crime. Some people murmured about rituals or madmen. Others said it was a message, a warning left in the open for all of Los Angeles to see. The officers immediately cordoned off the area, yet curious onlookers still tried to sneak closer, drawn by morbid fascination. What stood out most to detectives was the deliberate nature of the crime. This wasn't a murder of passion or impulse. Whoever did this had taken their time. They had drained the body completely, cleaned it with care, then transported it to the lot and staged it to be discovered. The choice of location, in a quiet but visible neighborhood, suggested the killer wanted the body found, wanted the world to see their work and recoil in horror. It was less an attempt to hide the crime and more a performance, an exhibition of cruelty meant to capture attention. The woman's identity was not immediately known. She had no identification on her, no personal belongings, nothing that could tell the police who she was. But within hours, fingerprints taken from her body were matched to records on file, thanks to the FBI's system. Her name was Elizabeth Short, a 22-year-old aspiring actress who had been living in Los Angeles only a short time. To the world. However, she would soon be known by another name, one that would forever eclipse her real identity, the Black Dahlia. For now, though, the police at the scene saw only the brutality of her death, and they realized immediately they were facing a case that would not be solved easily. The surgical precision of the cut suggested skill, perhaps someone with medical training. The absence of blood indicated the killing had taken place elsewhere, in a controlled environment, before the body was transported. Every detail pointed to a killer who knew what they were doing, someone confident, methodical, and perhaps with a desire to taunt law enforcement. As more detectives arrived, each theory grew darker. One suggested it was the work of a sadist who had killed before and might kill again. Another pointed out the symbolic nature of the posing, as though it were a message meant to degrade and humiliate the victim even after death. And yet, amid the horror, the scene was strangely clean. There were no footprints leading away from the body, no tire marks, no signs of struggle. It was as if the killer had vanished into thin air, leaving behind only his masterpiece of violence. The discovery of Elizabeth Short's body was more than a crime. It was a shockwave that rippled through the city, cracking the facade of Hollywood's dream factory. Already the first photographs were being rushed to newspaper offices, and soon the world would see her pale form sprawled in that vacant lot. But for those first on the scene, it wasn't just a case. It was a nightmare that would linger in their minds forever. The identification of the young woman found in the vacant lot came swiftly, but the horror of what had been done to her grew heavier once her name was attached to a face and a life. Elizabeth Short was only 22 years old, a girl who had left her home with a suitcase full of dreams, chasing the light of Hollywood with the same determination that drew so many others to Los Angeles in those years. Her friends described her as radiant, her black hair flowing like silk, her pale complexion contrasting with the red lipstick she wore almost religiously. That striking look earned her the nickname the Black Dahlia, a play on the 1946 film, The Blue Dahlia, though the real Elizabeth had far less power in her story than the women portrayed on screen. She drifted between apartments, sometimes staying with friends, sometimes with men she had met through her restless wanderings, always talking about her big break in the film industry that never seemed to come. Detectives quickly discovered that Elizabeth's life in Los Angeles had been full of shadows. She was known in cafes and nightclubs, seen often at Hollywood bars, always in the company of men who promised her glamour, connections, or perhaps just a warm meal. She was not wealthy and lived hand to mouth, sometimes borrowing from acquaintances, sometimes leaning on the kindness of strangers. She had been arrested once for underage drinking, which meant her fingerprints were already in the FBI's system, making her identification possible. But beyond those small fragments of her life, detectives began to see a picture that the press was eager to exploit. A beautiful young woman with a mysterious aura, entangled in a lifestyle the newspapers would twist into scandalous tales. The LAPD knew from the beginning that the brutality of the murder was not ordinary. Elizabeth's body told its own terrifying story. She had not only been cut in half, but her body had been drained of blood, scrubbed clean as though her killer was, erasing all traces of evidence. The cuts were precise, too precise to be the work of someone unskilled. A coroner's examination revealed that her body had been severed by something known as a hemicorporectomy, a surgical procedure that separates the body at the lumbar spine. This wasn't a cut made in haste or by accident. It was done with the steady hand of someone who knew human anatomy in detail. This led investigators to one of their earliest theories. Her killer could have been a doctor, a surgeon, or perhaps someone with medical training. The discovery of her Glasgow smile, the slashes carved into her cheeks, added another dimension to the horror. This was not only a murder, but a grotesque act of mutilation designed to shock. The coroner noted additional injuries, bruises on her wrists and ankles suggesting she had been bound, cuts and marks across her body that hinted at torture before death. The killer had not only wanted to end Elizabeth's life, but to leave behind a display, an exhibition of control and cruelty. Reporters fed on these details, crafting lurid headlines that made Elizabeth sound less like a victim and more like a character from a pulp magazine. They wrote about her supposed promiscuity, about the men she had been seen with, about the dangerous nightlife of Los Angeles, painting her as a woman who courted disaster. In truth, Elizabeth was young, vulnerable, and caught in a city that devoured dreamers. But the papers did not want sympathy. They wanted sensation. Each headline twisted her life into a tale of scandal, transforming her from a hopeful actress into a tragic figure of crime legend. The police worked furiously, pulling in suspects from all corners of Elizabeth's life. Men she had dated were questioned. Bartenders and waiters who had seen her wandering Hollywood Boulevard were interviewed, and doctors across the city came under scrutiny. Detectives believed her killer was intelligent and bold. They considered whether it could have been a stranger who picked her up off the street, or someone who had known her, perhaps a jealous lover. With each passing day, however, the case only grew more complicated. Leads fizzled, alibis checked out, and yet the brutality of the crime demanded that the killer was someone capable of far more than ordinary violence. As the press coverage grew, the public became obsessed. Los Angeles had seen murders before, but nothing so savage, nothing so theatrical. The very nature of the crime suggested the killer wanted attention, and the newspapers gave it to him in abundance. The city buzzed with rumors. Some whispered about connections to the mob, suggesting Elizabeth had fallen into dangerous company. Others speculated about secret affairs with powerful men in Hollywood, men whose reputations had to be protected at all costs. For every rumor, there seemed to be another door opening, another theory to follow. The police were drowning in tips, many of them useless, some deliberately false, sent in by pranksters or those craving their own moment of attention. Then, as if to deepen the madness, the police received a chilling package. It contained cut-out words from newspapers, arranged into taunting messages, mocking the authorities for their failure to find the killer. Inside were personal belongings of Elizabeth, short items that only the killer could have possessed, confirming that the person writing these notes was the very same who had staged her body. The killer was watching, laughing, feeding on the hysteria he had created. This was no ordinary criminal. This was someone who wanted his crime to live forever. Detectives followed the medical angle, looking into surgeons and medical students who might have had both the skills and the opportunity. One suspect was a doctor with a reputation for eccentric behavior and a history of violence. He became one of the strongest early suspects, yet despite interviews and evidence searches, nothing tied him directly to the murder. Another suspect was a nightclub owner who had known Elizabeth casually, but he too was cleared. It seemed every time the investigation closed in on someone, the trail collapsed into dust. Elizabeth Short's death was more than a tragedy. It was becoming a spectacle, a dark mirror reflecting the hunger of Los Angeles for both beauty and destruction. She had wanted to be a star, but now she was famous for reasons she never could have imagined. Her life was erased by violence, and her death was rewritten by the media into a twisted narrative that served the public's thirst for horror. The LAPD understood they were facing not just a killer but a mystery that was beginning to slip out. of their grasp, one that threatened to become bigger than the case itself. The Black Dahlia case did not remain a quiet investigation tucked away in police files. It erupted into the headlines like a storm. The newspapers seized on every gruesome detail, splashing the horror across front pages that sold out by the thousands. Photographs of the crime scene circulated, though heavily censored, with descriptions far more graphic than the public had ever read before. Los Angeles became a city gripped by morbid fascination, where neighbors gathered around radios and newsstands, trading theories as if it were a twisted form of entertainment. Elizabeth Short, who in life had been almost invisible in the crowded world of Hollywood hopefuls, was in death transformed into a symbol, not of glamour, but of cruelty and fear. Police struggled to maintain control of the narrative. They wanted the public's help, but the press was too eager for sensation to respect boundaries. Reporters crowded the LAPD, demanding updates, printing rumors as fact, and inventing lurid stories about Elizabeth's life. They painted her as a dangerous woman, a drifter who seduced men and lived recklessly, implying that her death was the inevitable consequence of her choices. Detectives resented this distortion, but the headlines created pressure they could not escape. The city demanded answers, and every passing day without an arrest was seen as failure. The LAPD worked around the clock, chasing leads that grew more tangled with each new revelation. The mockery from the killer only deepened the frustration. Weeks after the discovery of Elizabeth's body, the Los Angeles Examiner received an envelope addressed in clumsy handwriting. Inside was a collection of her personal belongings, her birth certificate, photographs, business cards, and a small address book. The note was crafted from newspaper clippings, each word cut out and glued in place. A puzzle-like taunt that read as if the killer were laughing at the very idea of justice. The items had been cleaned with gasoline, removing any fingerprints or traces that might identify their sender. Detectives were horrified not only by the audacity of the package, but by the realization that the killer was following the media coverage closely, feeding the frenzy, inserting himself into the story as though it were a play, and he the director. The police immediately launched a citywide manhunt, intensifying their interrogations and searching for anyone who might match the profile of a Black sadistic murderer with medical knowledge. Suspects emerged in droves. One was a surgeon with a suspicious past who had suddenly left town. Another was a man who claimed to have been with Elizabeth shortly before her disappearance, though his story kept shifting under scrutiny. Each suspect was followed, interrogated, and investigated, but none provided the smoking gun investigators so desperately needed. The sheer number of tips overwhelmed the department. Over 150 men confessed at one point or another to the crime, each with a story stranger than the last. Some were dismissed immediately as attention seekers, others as mentally unstable, but the waste of resources drained the investigation. Meanwhile, the public grew more obsessed. Hollywood itself seemed shaken, for the crime had pierced the shimmering bubble of fantasy that the studios so carefully cultivated. Tourists came to Los Angeles not just for the glamour of movie stars, but to drive past the lot where Elizabeth's body had been found, treating it as if it were a grotesque landmark. Newspapers exploited the hysteria, publishing lurid speculations that Elizabeth had been part of underground Hollywood parties, that she had angered powerful men, that her death was a warning to others. These were not truths but stories designed to sell, and in the process, they obscured the real investigation, burying the humanity of Elizabeth beneath layers of gossip. Inside the LAPD, tensions rose. Detectives argued over theories. Some believed the killer was a stranger, a predator who had snatched Elizabeth from the streets. Others were convinced he was someone she knew, a man from her chaotic circle of acquaintances. The surgical precision of the cuts kept drawing investigators back to doctors, surgeons, and medical students. A special task force was created, pulling in expertise from across the city. But with every week that passed, Evidence grew colder. Witnesses began to forget details, suspects slipped further away, and the sheer weight of public expectation began to crush the investigation. And still, the killer's voice lingered. More letters arrived, each composed from newspaper cuttings, each dripping with mockery. In one, the sender promised to turn himself in but never did. In another, he ridiculed the police for their incompetence, as though daring them to catch him. The LAPD tried to trace the origins of these notes, but nothing substantial came of it. The gasoline-cleaned envelopes gave no fingerprints, no DNA, nothing to hold on to. It was as though the killer was always one step ahead, carefully orchestrating the story from the shadows. Relishing the chaos, Elizabeth's funeral was held quietly in her hometown of Medford, Massachusetts, far from the glare of Los Angeles. Her mother and sisters mourned the girl they had known, not the infamous figure the press had created. But back in Los Angeles, the legend of the Black Dahlia was cementing itself into the fabric of the city. Tourists, gossip columnists, and amateur sleuths treated her death as spectacle, ignoring the real pain behind it. For the detectives working the case, the frustration was unbearable. They had a city demanding justice, a press painting them as failures, and a killer who seemed to take joy in their humiliation. The investigation dragged on, consuming resources, pulling in hundreds of leads, but every time it seemed close to a breakthrough, the evidence dissolved into nothing. It was like chasing smoke. The LAPD began to realize they were not only fighting a murderer, they were fighting a myth, a story that had grown larger than the case itself, fed by fear, speculation, and the deliberate cruelty of the person who had killed Elizabeth Short and turned her into the Black Dahlia. Years passed after the discovery of Elizabeth Short's body, and with each year, the Black Dahlia case grew darker, more tangled and more haunting. The early urgency that had gripped the city of Los Angeles gave way to frustration, and then to a resigned fascination as the case transformed from a criminal investigation into legend. Detectives had poured themselves into it, following lead after lead, chasing ghosts across the sprawling city, but nothing seemed to fit with certainty. There were suspects who looked perfect on paper, suspects whose backgrounds seemed to scream guilt, suspects who had motive, opportunity, and the necessary knowledge to commit such a crime. Yet no evidence ever tied any of them conclusively to Elizabeth's murder. And as the years stretched on, the truth seemed to retreat deeper into the cold shadows. One of the strongest early suspects was a surgeon with a history of disturbing behavior, a man who had once practiced medicine but whose reputation was marred by whispers of violence and obsession. His name surfaced repeatedly in police files, his connection to Elizabeth, tenuous yet intriguing. He had the skill, the knowledge, and the cold detachment required to cut a body with surgical precision. Detectives investigated him thoroughly, searching his home, combing through his background, and questioning those who knew him. Yet despite the suspicion, nothing ever materialized that could convict him. Other suspects ranged from nightclub owners to drifters to ex-soldiers, each man brought into the glare of the investigation for a moment before being dismissed and replaced with the next. Some confessed readily, almost too readily, offering wild stories that crumbled under scrutiny. Others remained silent, their names recorded only in files that gathered dust as the case moved further from resolution. The press, meanwhile, refused to let the case die. Every few months, the Black Dahlia appeared again in headlines, often tied to new suspects or bizarre theories. Hollywood was dragged deeper into the narrative with whispers that Elizabeth had known powerful men, or that she had been lured into the hidden world of parties and secrets that lay beneath the surface of the movie industry. Some claimed her death was the work of a mobster sending a message. Others believed she had crossed paths with a sadist who found in her the perfect victim. Each story sold papers, each story added to the myth, but none brought the police closer to the killer. The brutality of the crime made it almost impossible for the public to let go. Elizabeth's body had been not only mutilated, but staged in such a way that it demanded attention. It wasn't just murder, it was theater, a performance of cruelty meant to horrify. That staging left an indelible mark on the city's psyche because it suggested intent not just to kill, but to shock the world. And in that, the killer succeeded beyond imagination. The name Black Dahlia became infamous far beyond Los Angeles, becoming shorthand for unsolved horror, for the darkness that lurks behind beauty. Elizabeth Short, who had dreamed of becoming an actress, became immortal in the most tragic of ways. Her face and story etched into history, not for what she achieved in life, but for the nightmare of her death. Decades rolled on, and with them waves of renewed interest in the case. Books were written claiming to solve the mystery, each pointing the finger at a different suspect, each weaving together pieces of evidence that often contradicted one another. Some authors focused on the medical angle, insisting the precision of the cuts proved it had to be a surgeon or someone with similar training. Others suggested it was ritualistic, that the killer was driven by perverse symbolism. A few dared to suggest corruption within the LAPD had silenced the truth that someone powerful had been involved, and that the police had deliberately buried the evidence. These claims stirred controversy, but without proof, they remained theories, feeding the legend rather than resolving it. Among the most provocative claims was one made years later by a man named Steve Hodel, a former LAPD detective whose own father, Dr. George Hodel, had been a suspect in the original investigation. Steve Hodel published books arguing that his father not only killed Elizabeth Short, but may have been responsible for other infamous murders as well. He presented circumstantial evidence tying his father's surgical skills, his violent history, and his presence in Los Angeles at the time to the crime. Some of the evidence was chilling, including photographs that resembled Elizabeth and writings that hinted at obsession. Yet as compelling as his case appeared, it was still circumstantial, and no court ever tried George Hodel. For some, Steve's revelations were the closest thing to an answer the Black Dahlia case would ever have, while for others, it was yet another theory added to the endless list. The FBI files on Elizabeth Short revealed just how broad the investigation had become. At its peak, hundreds of suspects had been considered, more than 150 confessions taken, and thousands of pages of reports compiled. But even with that vast effort, the key pieces never emerged. No witness ever came forward who saw Elizabeth's final hours. No weapon or location was ever discovered, and no suspect ever broke down to give a credible confession that matched the forensic evidence. The killer had erased himself from the crime with terrifying precision, scrubbing her body clean and leaving nothing behind but horror. In that silence, he succeeded in creating not just a murder, but a riddle that would endure. For the people of Los Angeles, the Black Dahlia murder became more than a case, it became part of the city's identity. It was a reminder that beneath the glamour of Hollywood there lay streets where dreams rotted unfulfilled, where the desperate were preyed upon, and where darkness thrived. Tourists even today visit the site where Elizabeth's body was found, standing at the corner of Norton Avenue as if drawn by a ghost. Museums and crime tours include her story as a centerpiece, a symbol of unsolved mystery. She has been portrayed in films, referenced in television series, dissected in documentaries, and analyzed in classrooms. Her death has outlived her life, shaping culture in ways she never could have imagined. Yet at the core of it all, there remains the young woman herself, a girl who came to Los Angeles with hope in her heart, only to meet a fate that robbed her of her future. Elizabeth Short was not the scandalous character the press painted her to be, nor the femme fatale suggested by gossip. She was vulnerable, struggling to find her place, lonely, and searching for meaning in a city that devoured the weak. Her story resonates not just because of the brutality of her death, but because it reflects the fragility of dreams in a world that often exploits them. The Black Dahlia case remains officially unsolved. Files are still kept, though they have grown brittle with time. Detectives long dead, their notes yellowing in archives. Every few years, new investigators look again, hoping that modern science might uncover something the original detectives could not. DNA testing, fingerprint databases, new forensic techniques, all have been considered, yet the distance of time makes each breakthrough less likely. Witnesses are gone, suspects are dead, evidence has decayed, and the echoes of 1947 grow fainter. With every passing day, and yet the legend lives. People are still drawn to the Black Dahlia murder, not just for its horror, but for the mystery that endures. It represents something rare, a crime that refused to be solved, a killer who refused to be caught, a story that continues to haunt generation after generation. The name Elizabeth Short still appears in books, films, and conversations, her tragic face immortalized in black and white photographs. She has become more than a victim, she has become a symbol of the darkness that lurks beneath. The shine of Los Angeles. The Black Dahlia murder left behind no closure, no justice, and no answers. What it did leave was a chilling reminder of human cruelty and the fragility of hope. Elizabeth Short came to Hollywood to find a future. Instead, she found immortality in the cruelest of ways. And as the decades passed, the vacant lot where her body was discovered has long since filled with houses. The people who lived nearby are gone, and yet her presence remains. The Black Dahlia lives on, not in the stardom she once chased, but in the shadows of history, where her story whispers, still a reminder that some nightmares never end, and some questions are destined never to be answered. This is why the case remains unforgettable, why it still grips the imagination of writers, detectives, and ordinary people alike. Because behind the legend, behind the gruesome details and sensational headlines, was a young woman with dreams who deserved far better than to be remembered for the cruelty of her death. Her story is one of the darkest mirrors held up to Los Angeles. A mirror that shows us how quickly hope can turn to despair, and how some crimes are not meant to fade. Elizabeth Short, the Black Dahlia, may never have her justice, but her story will never be silenced for as long as people are drawn to mystery. And as long as cities hide their secrets in the shadows, her name will remain a haunting echo of beauty destroyed by darkness.